There's a classic joke that goes something like this. I'll play the flight attendant and you play man. Flight attendant, is there a doctor on board this plane?
I'm a doctor. What's going on?
This man is having a heart attack. Can you help? Do you know CPR?
I'm a doctor in philosophy. The only CPR I know is the critique of pure reason.
This man is going to die.
We are all going to die.
So we all experience pain and sickness in our lives at different times and to varying degrees. It's normally something we choose to avoid, and at the time we experience it, we'd probably be more grateful for a medical doctor than a philosopher. But in this episode, we're going to look at how philosophy can help us deal with pain and face life's struggles.
You know what? Really interesting. That just reminded me. There is a famous medical doctor I've heard speak before. I can't remember his name, but he's like a double or quad amputee. Happened during med school. Something stupid. He was like on top of a train and electrocuted or something. Anyway, and that just made me think like ironically, he's a medical doctor who talks a lot about the kind of acceptance and philosophy of death. And reading that just made me think, we should talk to that guy.
We should.
Hello, welcome to the Morality of Everyday Things. I'm Ant.
And I'm Jake. On this podcast, we're in season 3 now. Welcome. We look at everyday moral issues. And in this season, we've sort of branched a little bit more into, we've talked about the absurd. We've talked about sort of how to live your best life in some respects. We're branching out. We're exploring things.
Yes. So in this episode, we'll be talking about how philosophy can help us deal with pain, brackets, or life's struggles. Following that, we'll be talking about medicine. So we're taking I feel like it's still within the normal realms of what you'd expect a philosophy podcast to cover, right?
Yeah. It's maybe branching more off of, it's not just ethics. It's branching around ethics, but we should do a quick shout out to Stasha, which we forgot to do last time.
We've decided that we are going to actually shout out our sponsor more often. Our sponsor is us. But Stasher.com or Stasher Luggage Storage Apps. If you don't know, if you're ever traveling and you're in an Airbnb or something, you get kicked out at 10 a.m. This is an app that lets you book to store your bags with a local shopper hotel all over the world in 75 plus countries, 1,000-ish towns and cities, and all the main ones all over: New York, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, London, Cape Town. I'm thinking of a map and going down and across.
That's an interesting. Sounds like a great round the world trip.
Exactly, Australia, and hey, maybe one day we'll sponsor a round the world trip, and you can store your bags everywhere you go.
Woo! We'll create a discount code for listeners of this podcast as well.
Yeah, we actually should do that.
Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes or something.
Another little a little shout out, and I'll probably say this somewhere along the way as well. If you enjoy it, please do share with a friend. Please do leave a review, especially a written review on Apple Podcasts. Activity like that is what helps us hit 17th in the Apple charts for philosophy in Ireland, and I think we were 15th in Indonesia, which is actually a very big country, so fair enough.
The charts are so random, like the movement is,
I know, I love it.
Really fluctuates.
But if we can get into the top 10 in any meaningful geography, so any geography, with over 1 million people, that would be great, and we'd really appreciate your support in making that happen. One last thing. We were talking about this. I am going to create a WhatsApp group.
Oh,
I know. I'm going to create a WhatsApp group for all of our dedicated listeners, and I might I'll mention it in a separate post as well. I'll probably just like a little update one with a link to that, where we'll discuss upcoming episodes and also generally just give you guys access. Any thoughts or questions you want to discuss that don't necessarily fit into the pod, but fit into a philosophical life.
Absolutely. I mean, the part of the reason we started this is we love debating these questions ourselves, so we want to open those debates to more people and hear more of your ideas.
That was a long intro.
Okay.
Jacob, what are we talking about today? You're going to be, so actually, interestingly, we're doing back-to-back episodes. Jake has prepared one, so he's kind of going to lead, and then I've prepared one, and his is more specific to a book he's read that I have not read, so he's definitely going to be, we're going to lean on him a lot on this.
So, starting today, we're talking about a book, like I mentioned, and let me just introduce it. So last year I came across a review of it, and the review went something like this.
There was a caterpillar, and he was very, very hungry.
That's a reference to Ant's favourite childhood book and spirit animal. The review of this book went something like, a philosopher takes a new look at the meaning of life and comes up with an answer. So I was like, okay, my curiosity is piqued.
That's I get the intention of that statement, but it makes it sound so like,
it's a bit reductive, isn't it?
Well, it also sounds passive aggressive, right? It's like, man has question, comes with answer. But obviously the point is, what is the meaning of life is such an impossible question that to have any answer, any reasonable answer is, well done.
Well, this is it. So I was originally like, okay, I'm sort of skeptical but curious. But the book itself was called Life is Hard by Kieran Setiya. He's a professor of philosophy at MIT. The book was published in 2022, and thematically, it's really nicely put together. It basically breaks down into chapters that tackle the common hardships of humanity. And I'll list them quickly. Those
Hunger.
are actually, well, not hunger, but pain. We've got pain, we've got loneliness, grief, failure, injustice, the absurd. Shout out to our previous episode, and hope.
Interesting. Sounds like my CV. So, Jake, do you want to tell us? I mean, do you want to give us a little high level of your impressions of the book, and then can you tell us a little bit about how philosophy can help us with all these different forms of suffering and suffering in general?
Yeah, 100%. I really enjoyed it. I found it quite refreshing, and I think the thing I liked about it, and I do mention this later, but I think it sort of stood quite starkly in contrast with other things that kind of could fall into the self-help category. Whenever you read stuff that's generally a little bit like positive psychology, believe in yourself, all these things. And this guy almost took the like antithetical approach and was just like, life sucks. But this is how
life is hard.
This is how we can make sense of different aspects of suffering. And I think it links quite nicely on from the episode we did on the absurd, because one of the main arguments he makes is, life is absurd. It doesn't have any sort of prescribed meaning, but through the lens of his own experience and opinions of other philosophers, he sort of says, here's how you can kind of apply meaning and different approaches to living a more meaningful life. So yeah, quick sort of summary of that. I've kind of said this already, but through the lens of philosophy, he looks at life struggles, tells deeply personal stories, relates philosophical arguments, and helps readers gain a better understanding of hardships they may face, offering advice on how to make the best of them. The main quote of the book is, life is hard, but we can find joy and meaning in the struggle, which immediately recalls Sisyphus and what we were saying about Camus last time.
It's interesting but we can. It means it's not necessarily the case. Yeah. And it also implies agency.
Absolutely.
Right.
Which is exactly like we were saying in the Camus episode. And I really enjoyed it. So I've wanted to pay homage to it and share some of the ideas via this podcast and kind of add our own opinions to it. But yeah, because, we were joking in the intro that in times of pain, the last thing you really do want is a philosopher. But actually there is some quite fun practical stuff about how, on reflection,
Yeah, it's funny how again, like I said, it made me think of that medical doctor who talks about dying with dignity and stuff. In a weird little way, I was like, you know what, maybe in some circumstances, well, put it like this: in some circumstances, you'd rather a priest than a doctor, right? And for those non-religious of us, I was listening to podcasts where Kieran has spoken, and it was interesting. I was saying that a lot of kind of philosophical thought attempts to fill that religious void. So I could see an atheist who, in the position where someone, if it's terminal, it's near the end, the religious person would call their priest. Hopefully one day someone will call a philosopher. I want my final argument.
Maybe this is how we'll preserve jobs in the age of AI.
Yeah. I need podcasters. Bring them to me now.
So I've got a quote from Setiyah here. Maybe, Ant, you want to read this? It's quite nice.
Through much of history, there was no clear distinction between philosophical ethics and self-help. He writes early in the book.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, there was an awkward grammar there. There was no clear distinction between philosophical ethics and self-help. He writes early in the book. Ancient philosophers were interested in what makes a good life and a just society, and in virtues it takes to pursue both. So that would be particularly in reference to ancient Greeks. Aristotle particularly talked a lot about the good life. I'd say good with good G, with big G, sorry. And, just society, that would probably be Plato and the Republic, and also Aristotle's rebuttal. Not rebuttal, but, continuation. Not continuation. Anyway. But these central questions of human thriving now occupy the margins of the modern academic discipline. That's the quote. I would just like to say really quickly, it's so interesting when you use the word self-help book. It's so funny that we have this conception of the greats, right? Political philosophers from ancient history. But then when you think about it, I guess at some level, contemporary to their own time, they were just hawkers of self-help. Like you think the Stoics or whatever, and we think, it's this grand philosophical school. But at the time, they were just these guys who ran a school in Athens, and they'd just be out like shouting their stuff on the street, trying to, get people to come and listen to them, right? And it's like, I guess that's kind of the Tony Robbins of its day.
Well, it genuinely could be. And I found that really interesting because I think self-help sometimes has a bit of a negative connotation of like it ultimately has that possibility of capitalist capture and people are just kind of plugging ideas to make money. And it's, it has a sort of fakery about it. Maybe.
I get you. And it's interesting. How this makes me think about the greats or classics, right? I also mean this in terms of literature. It's funny how like sometimes I'm walking in a bookshop and I look around and I'm never interested in the new stuff. And then I think like, what if this stuff in 100 years, people will be like, this is one of the greats of its time. And I'm just missing that. There's a certain amount of contemporary greats. There's also a lot of stuff where people are like, this is great. And then I'm like, yeah, but this would be forgotten. And, you know, like there's a lot of contemporary authors. Like I remember there was that, maybe this is harsh and I haven't yet read it, but I remember there was that book, The Power or whatever.
Oh, was this the one about women having electric kind of, electric shock ability?
I remember, I haven't read it. And so it's a little harsh, but I remember hearing about it and seeing kind of the vibe around it. And I was like, this kind of just strikes me. This is like, it gave me like YA, like young adult populist. It gave me kind of popular YA vibes. I don't know that it's necessarily written in that style, but like it didn't speak to me like, oh, I like the theme, I guess is interesting and impactful, but it didn't strike me as like, this will be a great in 50 years time. And I don't know why. Sometimes this is the pretentiousness in me. But like I do enjoy reading greatly moving literature. I don't really bother reading fiction. I never read like on the one extreme. I never read airport fiction. And then I also kind of don't like. There's so much great literature to read. I don't really read things in the middle. So then I tend to read older fiction because it's already stood the test of time. And that doesn't mean it's all haughty stuff. Like at the moment, I'm reading Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Ah, Jules Verne.
Yeah, exactly. Which is like it's a classic. Like it's like it's not serious. It's not saying anything, but it's like fun but it's good enough that it's stood the test. Anyway,
it's an interesting digression though, because what makes a classic is a fascinating thing. Like Herman Melville, one of your favorite books, Moby Dick. When it came out, it was like panned by the critics. They were like, "This is crap." And then over time, it's become one of the sort of landmarks of literature. And people talk about the white whale. It's like a massively famous metaphor in general life. But.
Another good example in the realm of philosophy, Nietzsche. Not very popular during his own lifetime. Died not believing he was a particularly popular philosopher. Became popular posthumously. Another one, but this is a little unfair, Kafka. I mean, he didn't even publish his stuff while he was alive, right?
Oh yeah, his sister published it after his death.
There was no sense, I am a great author. That's actually another example of an author I really enjoy reading. And I kind of, I don't know if it's like when you go to a Michelin star restaurant, you have the mental context of like, this is great already embedded. Yeah. And then you're primed to enjoy it as a great thing.
You're less skeptical.
Yeah. And then it becomes great, right? But actually you're just a pretentious twat.
But I sold the brand.
But I feel like when I read his things, I do feel like it speaks to something about the human experience. Like Metamorphosis, right? Classic one, guy wakes up, he's a giant cockroach, right? It really speaks to something about loneliness, self-doubt, like a lot of very natural human experiences, right? And is also like a fairly compelling read.
Yeah, well, looping it back, it's fascinating because this is the point he makes early on is, you know, the classic philosophers.
Back to the podcast.
Yeah, the classic philosophers talked about, like, I guess in some ways they were the sort of self-help writers of their time, except that because they've stood the test of time, it's, you know, we look at those as great works of philosophy, and I think it would be harsh to just sort of label them as like ancient Greek self-help. Yeah, but I did find it interesting that he kind of makes this point that philosophy has maybe lost its place as a guide to living well, and there's definitely room for that.
Yeah, I would say if you think about the progression of norms, but then also philosophical thought from ancient Greeks to now, there's so much more emphasis on individualism, right? And liberty and all this, where like the idea of a prescribed good life, it sounds ridiculous. And that's not to say that Kieran agrees with that, because I think Kieran like actually explicitly disagrees with like the idea that there's one conception of the good life.
Yeah, he definitely does.
But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there's no guidance that can be offered towards a good life that like may differ from person to person, but be similar in form generally. Kind of like the Anna Karenina quote, right? Like,
yeah,
all happy families
are alike.
Yeah, happy are happily in a similar way, right? Like it could be that all happy people, though not identical, could be happy in, you know, through similar means, which would be the acceptance that we universally will suffer, and how we can deal with that. And also another good reference to this, Netflix podcast, Netflix show, Stutz. It was
familiar with it.
It was a documentary interviewing Jonah Hill's psychotherapist, or I think he's also actually like a literal psychiatrist, so I don't want to make him sound kind of, you know, fuzzy, but that was a really enjoyable, and one of his, you know, bunch of things that give you some perspective on life. And he was like, oh, the 3 things that are guaranteed in life. One of them is
death, taxes.
No. It was pain, uncertainty, and constant work. right?
Mm.
And the point he was making, it was particularly poignant because he's with Jonah Hill, right?
Mm.
He's saying, look, like, I'm sitting here with this guy, and Jonah Hill's like, I'm the guy. Like,
Mm.
supposedly I've achieved all the things that like any person who's struggling trying to become an actor wants to achieve, right?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, you still feel pain.
Mm-hmm.
Like the pain changes, you worry about different things, but you still feel pain. And you still feel uncertainty, like what's my life going to look like in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Will people love me? Like what's going to happen to my parents? All these things. And the third one is kind of a necessary result of those previous things, but you constantly have to work.
Even if it's just the constant work of survival.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
But the goalposts also move as your career progresses.
Pain specifically. What, Jake, we said, how can philosophy help with suffering in general?
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about pain specifically. Are we talking physical pain or?
Yeah, I think generally where he goes with this book is he's talking about physical pain. But I do think a lot of the points relate quite consistently with like emotional pain as well. So he opens up by offering a couple of definitions that are sort of important to the chapter he does on pain, although less important to our reflections here. But he says, disease is a matter of biological malfunction. Illness is more phenomenological. It's about how life feels and how you experience that. But let's jump ahead to...
Could you give examples to make that clear?
I don't have any prepared, but off the top of my head, something like, let's just take cancer. That's your body physically malfunctioning. That's like tumors and everything else. Whereas illness is maybe the impact that cancer has on you. And there's the psychological effects, the doubt, the uncertainty, to some extent, the pain as well. That's kind of the definition he draws there. Because he's then saying, disease is something you can treat practically. Illness is where philosophy maybe can help a little bit, in the way that philosophy is not going to cure the cancer, but it can at least help you deal with some of the effects.
Got you. Certainly, when you're saying illness is phenomenological, not biological malfunction, speaks a lot of mental illness, I would say, right? Like most of those things, we often use our brain chemistry, but like outside of, you can say someone's brain chemistry is different to normal, but like we also don't, when someone's like, oh, I have depression, we don't measure their brain chemistry to verify that, right? What we do is we look at collections of symptoms, right? So yeah, that speaks to that kind of, it's a phenomenological thing. It's how life feels.
Yeah.
Jake, an excerpt from Setiyah that helps explain the motivation for writing this book.
I'll skim through this. Basically, the way that he got into writing this book was he himself experienced chronic pain, and the first chapter is all about that, and a lot of it is his personal experience. And he says he felt philosophy was helpful in coming to grips with it. For him personally, aiming for some kind of ideal life is a very concrete form of limitation, which is that it's unlikely that the condition he has is actually curable or treatable, hence chronic.
Yeah.
And
so
therefore,
chronic pelvic pain.
Yeah, and he had to see loads of urologists and had a lot of pain down there, and it sounds pretty nasty.
Ooh.
Some of the things when you read it, it's like a little bit graphic. You're like, ooh, this makes me uncomfortable, even just hearing about it. So you feel sorry for him.
I do not know that. I didn't.
I haven't read it yet, but yeah.
Go on.
So the question for him then becomes not one of what is the ideal life, but given this circumstance, given that he's basically sort of resigned to living this forever, what is a good life in these circumstances? And he tells this anecdote that kind of brings us to life a bit. He says, I remember at some point when I was really taking in that my condition wasn't going to change, I was sitting somewhere and looking across the room and feeling a kind of bitter envy toward all the people walking by. You don't know how good you've got being pain-free, he thought. And then I paused and thought, actually, I have no idea what these people are going through any more than they have any idea what I'm going through. While it might not be physical pain, almost everyone is dealing with some kind of adversity. It might be loneliness. It might be grief. It might be failure in their life. It might just be watching the news and being horrified by what's happening in the world. And I think for me, that moment crystallized the idea for a book about how philosophy could approach the good life through the topic of adversity. Living well involves being in touch with reality. We have to live in the world as it is, not the world as we would wish it to be.
Interesting. I have two thoughts following that excerpt. It's funny because I have had the opposite experience, right? I think everyone's had this, where you meet people who are going through hardship, and you have this profound moment where you kind of feel like, how horrible that I have not, taken a second to kind of gather, like, this is how lucky I am. I remember once, I was in Colombia, in the rainforest of, no,
in the foothills of mountains.
Yeah. I was in Colombia and I was coming back from a night out, nothing too crazy, nothing too late. Like, I think it was like a maybe a Thursday night, gone for some drinks, seen some live music with some friends or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was coming home, and there's like a little cafe that's 24 hours or something across the street from me, a little bakery, and I was like, I'm going to get a snack before I go back. It was right next to a hospital. And so there's some people in there. I grab a snack. I get a little drink, and we're chatting with some people there. And I'm like, so what's going on here? And they're like, oh well, this is the time when the dialysis clinic lets out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically, I was chatting to this person who was a similar age to me, and they were explaining they were waiting for their sibling to come pick them up. And they were a fairly typical local Colombian person. So I mean, the average salary, is well under $1,000 a month. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's it's a relatively hard life for the typical person. It's definitely like, it's funny. It's one of those places where like you can go and live comfortably for sure, but for the average person, it's very much still a developing country.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this, we're talking, and I kind of realized like, man, like, I'd worry about whatever. It could be whatever silly thing. Like you have periods where you worry about like heartbreak, or like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, like what if my company is only sort of successful rather than super successful? And then,
well, we went through COVID.
yeah, exactly. Well, you have all these things, and then you meet this person who's coming out, first of all has to go and get dialysis at like 1 a.m. because that's when the slot's available, and then 2 has to, their entire family network has to really support them as well, because they need to be near the hospital, they need to go back and forth. It's hard for them to work, and they feel like they're a burden on their family and all this stuff. And you kind of have this profound moment of like, oh man, I actually have it so good, and my concerns are so petty compared to, so like, it's kind of like the inverse, where like, instead of thinking like, these people don't know how good they have it, I'm like, oh my God, I have it so good. Why am I worrying about silly things? That was one thing that kind of made me reflect on. And then the other funny thing is that like, I've also had kind of the inverse experience where like, when I say this so often, when you think of billionaires, do you think of happy people?
No, not necessarily. Well, I think of Citizen Kane, and therefore.
Yeah. It's funny how like so many of the people, this is again like a little backwards to what he's saying, but like so often the people you imagine is like, those are all the things I want. When I actually think about those people, it's like, oh, are those people actually happy? And then you kind of have that kind of inverse moment where it's like, why am I aspiring to the right things? Are the right things important? Because those things aren't making people happy. And I guess the point is just that same kind of sense of that profound, like, actually the phenomenological, like, lived experience is not defined by external things, but you also you don't know people's phenomenological experience. It's not determined by these outside fixed factors. And also, like, it's funny because I don't want to sound like going back to the story about the person in Colombia with the dialysis clinic. Like, I don't want to sound like I am unduly patronizingly pitying them. They seem generally like a pretty okay person. It was just a reminder that like my life circumstance is relatively good, and I should be appreciative of that.
Absolutely. I think that's important. I think you're getting pretty close to one of the themes as well around you don't know what's going on in other people's lives, and therefore one of the things that the experience of pain can really teach you is compassion and empathy, which is exactly what you're just saying. The last point about facing adversity and being in touch with reality, the last point that he was making there, is also like, that's a really central theme of the book. And there's an excerpt from the New York Times review that expresses it quite neatly, which if you would like to read for us, Anthony.
Life is hard pushes back against many platitudes of contemporary American self-improvement culture. Setiyah is no friend to positive thinking. At best, it requires self-deception. And at worst, such glass-half-full optimism can be cruel to those whose pain we refuse to recognize. He describes a situation many of us have experienced. We tell someone about an illness or a fight we had. They try to convince us not to worry so much or to focus on the bright side. Worse still, they might tell us that everything happens for a reason. This grotesque bromide is, explains Setiyah, theodicy, an attempt to justify suffering as part of God's plan. The problem is that it is not that it cannot be true. Theologians can extend divine providence to anything, even childhood leukemia, but that such thinking can easily serve as an excuse to avoid compassion.
Yeah, I found this really striking because when I was reading it, I was like, shit, I actually do this. I definitely have been that person who people are like really upset about stuff or you know, and I'm like, that's okay. Look on the bright side. Things will get better, you know. And I think, you know, my nature is optimistic, so I'm kind of like, you know, cheer up. And that's kind of often the way I might deal with my own suffering, is to be like, you know, it'll get better. It'll be fine. And I'm not saying that's not a helpful approach to some people.
Yeah,
but certainly the point he makes, and sometimes, you know, you experience this when you have pain yourself. You're not necessarily looking for sort of positivity or solutions. You are kind of looking for empathy, kindness, compassion.
Yep.
Someone to listen and
Yeah.
you know, and he's kind of saying this can just be a bit of a platitude, and it doesn't really hit the point.
I get you. I kind of, when I relate this to my life and particularly relationships, because what you described there, I feel as well, there is a part of the male lived experience. Sorry guys, we're going to turn into a podcast where two white guys talk about the male lived experience, but
it's not enough of those around.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's very a lot of the pressure or focus in your life is around fixing things. Right?
Well, that's definitely true. I agree with that.
Yeah. There's a lot of pressure on that, and then kind of a realization that, like, I think a lot of relationships I've had have been dysfunctional because, or ended up not working, largely because someone would come to me with a problem, and I would feel like, one, you're now burdening me with this problem, and two, my response is to fix it, and that means you're also making it my problem. And then, you know, I'd feel like I'm running two lives rather than one, right? And at some point, I'd be like, I don't want to do that anymore, right? And actually, I kind of realized part of a kind of adult approach to a relationship in that context is sometimes someone tells you something, and it's like, it's hard, but you have to accept, like, hey, like, not all of their problems are my problems. They just want to feel compassion right now.
I think that's it. Sometimes people care more about feeling heard and feeling empathized with than
you fixing their problem.
Fixing their problem.
That said, generally, I have found that fixing the problem does.
It depends, I think, on the problem, because I suppose there are some problems where an immediate fix isn't available, and as he's discussing, you know what? Often empathy has a place.
Exactly, and I feel like also this what you're describing there, the two cultural paradigms that this reminds me of is one, this kind of hustle culture, hustle porn, this kind of whole idea that, like, hey man, if you're not killing it, you're not working hard enough, and like an acknowledgement that sometimes, like, hey, look, all of that stuff is just focusing on outliers, lucky people, blah blah blah, and actually you're probably doing pretty well for where you're at. Like, calm down. And also, what's the point in all that? The point is to be happy. If you're constantly anxious that you're not successful enough, even if you are successful, really you're failing at the most important thing.
100%.
Yep. That was one, and then the other one that it kind of reminds me of is a discompassionate approach to politics. This kind of right-wing perspective that, like, anyone who's poor, it's their own fault because they're not working hard enough, right? Though that perspective kind of reminded me of those, that personal edge, the first one I talked about in relationships. Sometimes, you know, a partner just wants compassion, and you need to draw a line and not let their problems be your problems necessarily. And, you know, you want to help, but
there's a healthy balance to be struck.
And then the other thing was, like, hustle culture and political lack of compassion, which are probably linked, right? Like, I think
I'd say so. Yeah.
It's no coincidence that hustle porn, hustle culture is very American, and also the American dream is very kind of like, I hustle because I'm rich, and then I'm great because I'm rich, and then
everyone else, by definition, must suck because they're poor.
Exactly. And like, actually, one of the things that really annoys me about the about American culture is that they then do this weird backwards logic where it's like, because people who work hard can succeed, anyone who's successful must be great
and must have worked hard.
And then they see people like Trump, and lots of people are like, yeah, but he's rich, so he must be smart. And he's like, no,
it's a halo effect, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. He literally has destroyed more value. He just inherited a ton of money from his father, and his father just created slums and overcharged people. Like, you know, his greatest success was access to capital and early access to the Manhattan real estate market. That's it, right? Like, I think another good example was I was reading about Aristotle Onassis last night, right?
Onassis is in, like, Jackie Onassis, and
he was a Greek shipping magnate, right?
Yeah. It was her father, right? Jackie Onassis' father, was that him, or was that
no? Because Jackie Onassis was Jackie Kennedy, and she remarried Aristotle Onassis.
It was her husband.
Yeah,
Sorry. Okay, yeah.
He, Greek shipping magnate, and basically I didn't realize. I just assumed he was an heir, right? He wasn't an heir. He was born in Greek part of Turkey, near Izmir, and the Turks kicked out the Greeks, so his family was wealthy, lost all its wealth. They did like cigarette factories there, right? So he moves to Argentina at like 18 or something, and he got a job. He was not exactly a polyglot, but spoke 4 languages or so.
It's not bad.
Yep. So he was doing the switchboards, right? For some telephone company, and basically the way that he got rich was he, first of all, was getting inside trading tips because he was listening to all the calls. So he was just printing money, making it easy. And this is like a different time when, like, the markets moved much slower. If you had inside information, you could make big bets, right?
You had a big edge.
Yep. And then also a little bit of connection with Greek community in Argentina. He was able to like basically get some like access loans and be, talked into getting a little bit of control so he could get a loan to set up a factory, and did import export and had a lot of price control. And it was one of those things you kind of realize like, oh, like it's not that this person was like, they did well and they were smart, etc. But like a lot of it was kind of circumstance that gave them a privileged position that they took advantage of. And it just kind of reminded me of that. It was, again, relating to the Trump and American kind of.
We'll loop this back to pain, but let's take a quick ad break and then we'll be back. We're back. A quick digression to focus specifically on pain, but linked to the philosophy of sort of mind-body dualism. This is a point he makes in the book that is, I guess, quite philosophically interesting. A really obvious thing to say, and something we didn't say earlier, but it's important, is that pain forces us to attend to our physical bodies. And that's an obvious, practical, important point to make. In an anthropological sense, one of the sort of
Or
things,
sociological,
one of the things people say about pain is that, it just forces you to attend to problems, right?
Yep.
And that's the sort of practical benefit. But sometimes pain can be illusory, particularly chronic pain, and that's really sad, and that's what Kieran Setiya himself suffers with. Now, Descartes is one of the preeminent philosophers who conceived of the body and the mind as kind of dual entities. But then he has this quite interesting quote where he bemoans the frustrations of pain, bringing you back to the physical realm, like away from the sort of pleasures of intellectualism. And there's this quite nice metaphor he has about a ship where he says, "I'm not present in my body as a sailor is present in a ship. We form a unit. If this were not so, I wouldn't feel pain when the body was hurt, but would perceive damage purely by intellect, like a sailor perceives by sight when anything is broken." What Kieran Setiya goes on to say, though, is that this dualism is unhelpful because we are essentially embodied, and pain is an ever-present and painful reminder of that nature of existence.
Makes sense. I mean, so yeah, mind-body dualism is basically the philosophical approach that these are two separate things. And he's saying that this idea of the dualism of it kind of doesn't actually properly explain the connection between the two things.
Yeah.
Or at least it implies a bigger disconnection than there is.
That's exactly what he's saying.
And yeah, mind-body dualism is part of. Okay, there's a metaphysical argument around this as well. Metaphysical is beyond literally the physical realm. Rather, there is an assumption that the metaphysical is not relevant and that the world that we live is the real world and the only world that matters, right? Because if you say, for example, say we live in the Matrix, then the body is kind of irrelevant.
Yeah.
Right? But I think that's, certainly it's one of those things where like, even if you do live in the Matrix, it's best to act in that way anyway, that that the body is real and this is the real world.
And this really ties back to his whole sort of theme about you need to face adversity. There's no good sort of pretending. He also has this really interesting point that he says pain is finkish, and I'd never heard the word finkish before.
I saw that and I was like, did you misspell finish?
No, so finkish is, the best way I can explain it is, he says, when you're in pain, often all you want at that moment is like, I just want to be out of pain. And the idea of being out of pain is like this kind of blissful state that you aspire to. But obviously, as soon as you're out of pain, it's not like you're like, my body feels amazing. As soon as you're not in pain, your body just kind of recedes to the background and you don't really notice that you're not in pain. He says, the illusion of the bliss of painlessness is like turning on a light to see the dark. And that's what he means by pain being finkish. And in his case of chronic pain, that's particularly relevant.
It's more an absence of inhibitors than it is a actively pleasant situation.
Yeah.
When I want to turn on the light, I don't go, woo. I look around the room constantly, right?
Yeah. He's quite funny though, because he says, essentially this is a kind of paradox. And that for some people might give you some kind of solace, because you're like, maybe those with a more sort of philosophical turn of mind are like, it's kind of funny, at least, like, you can appreciate being in pain more because you're like, at least this kind of bliss of painlessness doesn't really exist. So, you shouldn't focus on it. But he was like, some people might just find that even more upsetting. So this may not help this observation, but it is ultimately the truth. The final point he then makes about pain is that it can be very isolating, but this loops back to what we were saying earlier. Philosophy, in this respect, gives us the solace that other people also feel pain. And what he says that we should really take from this, if we're looking for meaning in suffering, is that pain should teach us compassion. And when we have our own experiences of pain, then when other people go through something similar, you can really relate to it. And I mean, to give a trivial example, I know when I broke my wrist, which was a few years ago, it's the first time I'd ever broken anything, but you suddenly do have this appreciation, not just of the pain people experience when they've broken something, but also like, God, casts are really annoying. And that inconvenience is something that like you can imagine, sure, when you see other people with broken bones, but once you've experienced it firsthand, you're like, oh man, I really know what that's like. And in some ways you can offer more help from having gone through it yourself.
Any practical takeaway from that?
Yeah, as I was saying, I mean, he's kind of obsessed with this notion of truth, and he says it's really important to pay attention to suffering because this is how you learn from it. It's how you generate resilience. He has this other concept about the trap of the future. He says pain exists in a series of present moments, and therefore attending to it is facing up to adversity and avoiding being stuck in this kind of state of like, oh my God, I'm going to be in pain forever. This is terrible. This is disaster. And he says you can avoid that by just being
accepting.
Being kind of mindful of it, accepting that this is where we are now.
Sounds very Nietzschean. Sounds very, I mean, first of all, if you think Nietzsche is one of those people who like, you know, when I think of the people I love, I wish them suffering, right? Because it builds a stronger person. So that's not quite the same, but you know, that's something he says. The bit that sounds similar to something Nietzschean would be, we discussed in the absurdism episode, amor fati, love of fate, right? Or sorry, as I'm accenting the A incorrectly, as my Italian friend pointed out, amor fati.
Amor fati. Great philosopher.
This sense of accepting fate, right? And that including the negative elements of your life, like pain and suffering, and actually being grateful to be able to experience things, right? To not be, because to not have these things would be to be numb. And to be numb would actually be a lesser life for sure. Interesting. Are there limits? Sorry, I mean we've covered a lot of pain, mind-body dualism, etc. Next, I want to bring up the idea of are there limits to what philosophy can teach us? We've talked a lot about learning compassion. We've learned a lot about kind of acceptance. We've learned a lot about happiness, etc. What are the limits to what we can learn from this philosophy?
So for him, he says, you know, there are limits, but philosophy in general can be really helpful when it involves attentive description. And being able to describe something properly can play a comforting role for people experiencing anything, basically. So one thing he says here, and this kind of relates, I suppose, to my understanding of like therapy as well, is that people often find solace in having something accurately described. Even if there's no immediate solution, being able to kind of correctly label your own experience fosters a sort of solidarity with the problem at hand, and that can be meaningful. There's a philosopher and novelist called Iris Murdoch, and she says that finding the right words to describe personal experience or societal events is crucial for understanding how to navigate them, navigate the emotions, determine the appropriate actions. And I think this is what he'd say is that, you know, obviously there are limits in some respect, but there's consolation in being able to attentively describe stuff, and philosophy can provide that, and that should be applicable across the board.
I have very mixed feelings on this.
Go for it.
Right? I agree. I think part of the reason that we see, for example, many, many more people being diagnosed with mental health issues, right? Part of that is that, you know, there's this sense of like something feels wrong and you do search for this explanation, and then it can in a way be helpful. Like if you are like, oh, you have extreme ADHD or you have depression or something like that, right? You feel validated. You feel like, like I knew something was wrong. And this helps explain why I'm not the way I want to be. And the other thing is that it literally helps you like, oh, okay, so now I can actually find more information around other people who have these problems, right? And I'm not alone, right? The problem I have with it is a question of agency. I know a lot of people will also want a lot of people kind of want these labels to kind of feel, you know, ironically, we're talking about mind-body dualism, right? This is also a sort of mental dualism where it's like, oh, there's me, but then there's the this, right? And it's not an understanding of like, no, this is more a label that describes people who behave in a kind of collection of ways, and you seem to be sort of one of those people. But basically, it's this idea of like, oh, well, no, I can't help it, I'm blah. Right?
Or is this like the notion of like, I have anxiety, as if it's like a property that you possess?
Exactly, as opposed to like, I am currently a person who's behaving anxiously.
Yeah.
Right? Which is probably a better articulation.
I would say so. And I totally get what you mean, because I think sometimes people can become so fixated on sort of labels and putting themselves in boxes that actually, you know, you do miss this broader point that all of these are part of the human condition. And
exactly. And you do have some agency over this. I mean, you give a great example. It's safe to assume she doesn't listen. Jake has an ex-girlfriend who at some point basically read The Power of the Introvert and then basically decided, oh, I'm not antisocial or rude. I'm just an introvert. And that empowers me to be rude.
Yeah,
I can't help it. That's just, I'm an introvert. And it's like, no, you're a person with agency. You are choosing to be rude.
Without going too much into that, I agree. It was a bit of an episode, because she identified so strongly with this book on introversion that she started like adopting loads of sort of properties that she was reading in this book, and a lot were sort of socially unhelpful. And for me, I was like, we want to be able to go out and do stuff, and it became like a justification for staying in and
Yeah.
not doing so much stuff. So.
And I definitely know people who, depression is supposed to something that you are supposed to like address and try and deal with. They might then be like, oh, well, I can't, they might wallow a bit sometimes and be like, oh, I can't help it. Like I am this. And it's like, well, that means you should pay more attention. Like you still have agency. It means you should pay more attention to combating this because you currently have symptoms that fit you in this category.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, let's, I don't want to get too stuck because we're short of time.
Yeah, let's whiz through. There's only a few more points to make. One thing I wanted to talk about was optimism. And for me, this was a really interesting takeaway of the book as a whole, was suffering teaches us empathy, but blind optimism can exacerbate suffering. And this is kind of like what I was saying earlier, where like you want to offer solutions or you'd be like, cheer up, everything's going to be all right. Life's pretty good. And that's not necessarily what people need. But more particularly, and you linked to this point earlier too, concepts of an ideal life, which are central to many philosophers' work, can actually put us off living a good enough life. It's like influencer culture. The great can be the enemy of the good. And one thing he says is, life has too many variables for a perfect life to exist. What we're really after is a good enough life. And there are so many different variations on that. Funny little tangent was I was reading this book at the same time as I was reading Candide by Voltaire. Have you read that?
You're so pretentious.
I know, I love it. This is the
I have not read
the
Candide by
perfect
Voltaire.
platform to be pretentious.
No, I mean, to me, I can't really say this. Like,
Moby Dick.
Yeah, I love Moby Dick.
I'm reading Jules Verne.
Yeah, I do a podcast. I don't like reading modern fiction. Sorry, carry on about Candide.
Quick one on Candide. It's a really short book, so it's super readable. And basically, it's a satirical novella. It follows the journey of a young guy called Candide who's raised with the belief in the philosophy of optimism. He has this tutor called Pangloss who's like, life is the best of all possible worlds. But basically then everything proceeds to go wrong. He encounters war, natural disasters, all sorts of suffering through his travels, and his worldview is challenged, and he begins to question this notion that we actually do live in the best of all possible worlds. And in Candide's case, it's kind of religiously motivated, but Voltaire uses the book to be like, this is bollocks, basically, and life is actually full of suffering, and life is absurd, and this isn't the case. But he makes it very funny. Anyway, for me, I was reading these two things at the same time, and I was like, God, this feels like a two-pronged attack on the virtues of optimism. But my personal takeaway was optimism in itself isn't bad, but there is a virtue to recognizing suffering and reality and facing it with compassion and empathy. So, it's not that optimism is bad, perhaps, but blind optimism. And this kind of, for me, it was never religion, but I suppose American style self-help about like positive psychology was maybe my personal experience of that.
Obsessive religious kind of like, it reminds me of, I know people where it's like, oh, I'm manifesting stuff, right? It's the difference.
Right.
It's the difference between believing that literally and believing like, well, no, but like, hey, without self-belief, I'm not going to achieve X, Y, Z. It's Americans almost have like this kind of culty religious. Sorry, Americans. Some people almost have this religious culty like, I am the greatest. I need to wake up and look in the mirror and say, oh my God, and it's like, well, like sometimes it's okay to, I do want to look in the mirror and be like, I believe I can do great things. But I also want to be like, but at the same time, like,
you just want to do it with a British accent.
Yeah, exactly. Which I'm not halfway to. But, it's also this acceptance like, but if I don't necessarily achieve all these things, like that doesn't mean I'm a failure in life. I didn't hustle hard enough or whatever. I understand what you're saying. Yeah. It's not optimism is bad. It's blind optimism. The considered life is important.
Absolutely.
Stoicism. Tell me about stoicism.
So Setiyah's approach, by now you've heard a lot about it. It might sound similar to the worldview of the Stoics. So we'll very quickly talk about those. Do you want to give us this description I've read about the man?
Yeah, I think that's fair. The description's quite good. Stoicism is a philosophical school of thought that originated in ancient Greece and later became influential in ancient Rome. So Marcus Aurelius, very famous one, wrote Meditation. It teaches individuals to cultivate inner tranquility, resilience, and virtuous living through the acceptance of what is within their control and recognition of what is not. Stoics believe that the key to happiness lies in aligning one's actions and judgments with reason and virtue, whilst accepting the inevitable uncertainties and hardships of life. Basically, this part I'm now ad-libbing. Stoicism is basically kind of the school of thought that you can't control what happens in life, but you can control how you feel about what happens, and ultimately how you feel the phenomenological circumstance of your conscious existence, as far as you're concerned, is reality.
Now, I've always respected the Stoic approach and kind of like probably without really thinking about it too much, kind of absorbed it into my own worldview quite seriously. But this is something I found interesting is that Setiyah is not himself a Stoic and would actually say his approach has a key difference and he flags this sort of following nuance. And he says, I think there's a way in which just accepting things can be a failure to acknowledge how bad they are. And sometimes you have to rail against even things you can't control. So he's not saying that you do control things, but he's saying, again, it's important to face up to adversity and not be like, oh, that sucks. Okay, that's the way things are. He's sort of saying, even if it's impossible, you want to fight against injustice and you want to sort of, the struggle is important.
I get that. Because I guess one of the criticisms of Stoicism is that the perfectly Stoic life is the dispassionate life, right?
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the life you want to live. You put in the notes here, and I think this is very fair. Setiyah's approach kind of reminds you a little bit of Nietzsche's kind of idea of the will to power, and that like sometimes negative emotions. I actually really like this view as well, where like I've had this with a few people recently. It's really interesting how like there is a for example, there'll be movements around acceptance of your of body images, right? Or like unrealistic body images and your body image. And like it's funny how like I think that's very healthy, and I think that there's a lot of unrealistic body standards on both genders actually.
Definitely.
I think people kind of neglect that like for men, like every Hollywood star is on a ton of juice, right? Like
and by juice you mean steroids, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, like, Chris Hemsworth, and it's like, follow this workout and gain 20 kilos of muscle in 6 months. And it's like, well, I don't think it's because you're doing 5 sets of 3. And also get shredded at the same time. But no, the point I make is that like there's this nuance in between where like the Stoic approach or like the caring approach becomes this kind of like acceptance. Yeah, everyone is great. But then there's actually this synthesis in the middle where it's like, whilst you shouldn't have unrealistic standards, and you should, have acceptance within like quite wide and reasonable bounds, that's not to say that suddenly like, I personally think like
you're divorced from personal responsibility to look after your body. Is that what you're saying?
Not just personal responsibility, but that like it's a admirable goal to set yourself to be like, I actually want to be in good shape though. So like the kind of Nietzschean idea that like if you see a picture of someone and feel jealous, that's probably a little psychological like poke to you that like we'll do something about it, right? Like your two options are accept it and let go of it, or do something about it. And the first one's the Stoic one, and the second one's the Nietzsche one.
And actually, what you've kind of made me think is maybe, correct me if you disagree with me, but possibly there's this spectrum here of like you've got American positive psychology. It's like you can look like these models too, and then you've got the Stoics who are like, it's unrealistic. Who cares? Like,
and there's this thing in the middle.
And then Setiyah's thing, kind of maybe in the middle, is a little bit like you can rail against the fact that models set unreasonable standards, and you can dislike that while still, having an aspiration to take care of your own health and not being like, I could never be like this, and so I'm going to wallow in pity. There's something in the middle that's maybe the perfect balance.
That's exactly it. Where like my personal takeaway, part of like when I think about my own kind of growth as a person or whatever, it's like acceptance. Like particularly as a man, it would be like you don't need to have a 6-pack, right? But that's not to say suddenly like I'm going to eat whatever I want all the time and
feel sorry for yourself.
Or not even feel sorry, but like go full dad bod and be like, it doesn't matter. I accept myself, right? Like you can both think that like some standards have gone too far, or they're unrealistic, or the obsession around it is unnecessary and not fruitful in terms of actual happiness, while still saying, but I do want to have a commitment to like keeping myself in decent shape, keeping decently healthy, keeping decently fit. It's just about setting bounds that are healthy and reasonable. Right?
I suppose equally, that approach could cover, I do want to go full workout mode, or I don't care about this, and I'm actually very happy to just like enjoy my food. And
exactly. It's like time and place. It's because the acceptance could be the thing. Too much acceptance could be the thing that basically is like, well, why does anyone bother becoming an athlete? Because it's quite hard, and you could just accept that you're not going to be exceptional, right? And it's like, well, some people actually want to be, and that's a thing we should encourage and celebrate.
Yeah, I should say, Setiyah doesn't talk about body image or anything in his work. This is us extrapolating from kind of where we've taken his philosophy. So
the body image one is probably relates more about my psyche than anything else. But it's just an interesting thing I see a lot, particularly because of the two things being very unrealistic male body standards, because of the kind of like I think people do not realize how many people are taking steroids, right? Like, and that's like the perfect example of unrealistic body standards, right? The same way that Photoshop is like it's literally not possible to look like a Photoshop person all the time. It's not possible to look like someone who is literally taking a chemical to take you beyond human potential. That's one part, and then the other part would be the interesting development, because likewise, women had terrible body image issues. Not women, but the particular fashion industry and stuff like that, and still does to some extent. but that there's a wider movement around acceptance, and that's like very widely talked about. But I don't feel like that's as much of a thing in the male space. So that makes a really interesting contrast. But I also, like I say, like I think acceptance and happiness shouldn't then be like, and don't care at all about what you look like. I mean, I like I said a number of times now, it's that synthesis between like there's an amount that is ridiculous and not healthy and not helpful, but you can still be like, you can still feel motivated to want to achieve some amount of that thing.
So there we go, philosophy related to personal experience of suffering. And shall we wrap up here with the pain episode? Do you want to give me any of your thoughts on this? And I'll do the wrap up.
It feels like he's speaking to this. I like the optimism, but not blind optimism is a good way of putting like there's basic, and the whole discussion we just had around the Nietzschean stuff is like, there's this space between like disconnected, dispassionate stoicism and unfair, unreasonable standards,
overzealous,
overzealous, hardcore Nietzscheanism. There's this quite wide space in the middle, which really we want to be occupying, where like we acknowledge pain, we do take it as a way to improve, but then we also don't turn it into a stick to hit people with, where like, you are not the best person you can be. Like, no, there's this pretty wide space in the middle where like you are passionate about life, you're connected, but it's not blind and it's not unfair and dispassionate to other people.
Man, I really like that. That's actually maybe better than my summary. That's great.
Go on, Jake. Give us your bogus attempt.
Yeah, my 2 cents. I do think there's something really warm and practical about this approach, and it's part of the reason I love the book so much. Was I was like, wow, this is, it's refreshing. And I like this notion that philosophy can help us deal with pain and suffering. Because I like philosophy, so it's nice to feel like it can do something useful. But also because, as he describes, our reflections on our own experience of pain can give us compassion and empathy for other people, and I think that's a really nice takeaway.
That was a funny thing you phrased, though. You said, I like philosophy, so I'm glad it can be useful.
Yeah.
I think instead, is it not that like you engage with philosophy because naturally you actually find it useful, and it's nice to hear it practically explained that way.
Yeah, I was being kind of flippant, but
yeah. It's like, I like philosophy, so it's cool that you can do stuff. It's like, you don't randomly like philosophy and avoid and hey, it's nice, it's useful. There's a reason you connect with philosophy.
Yeah, definitely. Correctly labeling our pain, as he says, can guide us to the right solution, be that physical or emotional, and moreover, it can drive us to future solutions to help prevent pain for other people, such as, the example I thought of was like people who run marathons to raise money for cancer research, and that in future makes life better.
That's an episode I want to do one day.
100%.
It's actually kind of different. It's like, how much suffering do you need to do for it to be worth
fundraising to be valid?
For fundraising to be valid, right?
Yeah, we've had that discussion before.
Yeah. Okay,
but
cool, guys.
Just to wrap up, life has in many ways got better, and common hardships like war and famine, they're now fewer and further between than they were before. But I think what's nice is, and he sort of gets this point across too, is people are more aware of the importance of kindness to each other, because everyone experiences pain. So when we go through pain, we're able to understand and empathize better with other people's experience and help them through it. So in the face of an absurd world, Anthony.
Absurd.
What did I say?
No, I was just making fun of the way you said it.
In the face of an absurd world, what better way do we have to face our suffering if not together? And on that note, guys.
Wow. Thanks for that. Guys, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed that, give us a message. You can find us all over the place. Don't forget, you need to store your bags, stasher.com. We'll do a discount code. And also, if you want to join the WhatsApp and argue and tell me that I'm an idiot, say, Jake, that you like his new haircut, do it.
Thanks, guys.
Do it, guys. Thank you very much.